All right, so in this next subsection here of Toynbee's study of history, he moves on to what he calls the Sumeric, or Sumerian, as it's normally called, society. He goes back looking beyond the Indic society that he had discussed as one of the living societies, the Indic and the one that he divided it up into, the Hindu. And he finds that the universal state being that of Sargon of Akkad's universal state, circa 2350 BC, as the universal state lying behind that. This chapter is a bit more successful, I think, than the previous couple have been in his discussion here. So this is a map of Mesopotamia, circa 3500 BC, and we can see that in the south are a cluster of cities, pretty much the earliest ones. It generally moves, the evolution of the society moves from south to north. And here at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, we've got Eridu, which is very possibly the oldest of all of these cities. This is 3500 BC. And then the two very important cities, Uruk and Ur, which are regarded as sister cities. And then up north, we have other cities such as Nippur, which was the Vatican, let's say, of Mesopotamia, the sacred city. And then off to the east there, over the Zagros Mountains, we have their mortal enemies, the Elamites, Elam, who nevertheless represent part of the culture. And it's a two-ethnicity culture. In origin, it begins with the Sumerians, who spoke an agglutinative language that we don't know where it came from. It probably goes well back into the Neolithic. And then the Akkadians, who spoke a Semitic consonantal language. So we have these two ethnicities, and they sort of vie for control. Sargon of Akkad was, of course, an Akkadian. So that's the first Semitic state that is formed, and it is the world's first universal state, actually. It only lasts for about a century, from about 2334 or thereabouts down to about a century later. All right, so let's take a look here at what the city-states look like. These are city-states analogous very much to the Greek city-states. They're self-governing, they're separate from each other, and each has its own independent ziggurat. This is actually not Ur at 3500. I noticed this is a much later ziggurat from the later period, when the ziggurats get monumentally gigantic. Nonetheless, it would have looked something like this in 3500. And each one of the city-states was ruled by one particular deity, or was ruled by the moon god Nanesene. And it's from Ur that Abraham leaves in the Old Testament. And then its sister city-state of Uruk, there were two primary gods there, the sky god On and his daughter, the goddess Inanna. Probably the three most important deities of all of Mesopotamian civilization were Enki and Enlil, the battling brothers. Enki is the creator god who creates mankind as a race of slaves out of clay figurines, whereas Enlil is the destroyer god, who is the god of the thunderclap. He's a farmer god. He invents the hoe. His son Ninurta invents the plow, but he's the one who sends the flood that wipes man out. Enki creates, Enlil destroys, like the left and the right hands of God. And the third most important is, of course, the goddess Inanna, who later becomes the Semitic goddess Ishtar, the goddess of not only of... Inanna is only a goddess of love and sex. She has no offspring, and she had what's called a naditum, or a temple of sacred prostitutes that were sacred to her. She is not a goddess of fertility or a mother goddess in any way, shape, or form. She's associated with the planet Venus with love and sex. And then when the Babylonians come in, or actually when the Akkadians conquer, they change her into the Semitic equivalent, Ishtar. Okay, so, and here's another early, this is from 3500 BC. This is another early nucleus for what will later become the giant ziggurats. This is the city of Ubaid, and the city here is in the shape of a cosmic vagina, sacred probably to Inanna. And then here we have the White Temple of On, the god On, at Uruk. And you can sort of see how these early temples were monumental, but not colossal like the later ziggurats that we have in our mind's eyes as stepped pyramids. This is also at Uruk, the Iana Temple at Uruk, which features the first columns in the world they were 3 meters round, and here's what they looked like. They have this what's called a stone cone mosaic, and those zigzags there represent the watery abyss, what's known as the Apsu, from which eventually the word abyss comes. And Enki is the lord of the watery abyss, and he's the primary god of the southernmost city of Eridu. And the Persian Gulf is sort of regarded as the cosmic abyss from whence he comes. And Dilmun was regarded as, where Bahrain is now, was the sacred island of Dilmun, where Enki's son lived, Insak. And here we have a very early sculpture, a Sumerian priest king who was known as an Ensi. An Ensi is a priest king who governs at a local city-state, whereas later, once the great kings, the great man, the Lugal, comes in, starting with Lugal Zagesi, who just before Sargon actually starts the process of the creation of the first universal state in Sumer. The Lugal rules over all the land, whereas the Ensi is particular to a specific city-state. Now, this may be a statue. It dates from about 3300 BC of the mythological character known as Dumuzi. He is the shepherd king. And then here we see the Worka vase. This is from 3200. And we have the king, a figure at the top left there that is the Ensi, the equivalent of the character depicted on that statue. But what this depicts is a vision of the great chain of being stratified into hierarchy. If you look at the bottom layer, we have, although it's cut off here, the watery abyss on the corner left. And then immediately above that, we have the world of plants arising out of the watery abyss. Then in the next stratum above that, we have the realm of animals. And then in the stratum above that, with these naked hierophants, bald, bringing offerings toward the gods, moving from right to left, as though they were ascending a ziggurat. And then at the top, with the king, the Ensi, coming in from the left, they're bringing in the offerings. And he is approaching a goddess who stands in the middle there, beside these two, what look like spears, but they're not. They're bundles of reeds that are symbolic of the goddess Inanna. So this is the goddess Inanna who is receiving the offerings from this priest who is just coming in front of most likely Dumuzi. So this is the story of Dumuzi and Inanna goes well back, right to the foundations of the civilization, in which Dumuzi plays the first of the dying and reviving gods, who she descends down into Irkala, the underworld, through 7 stations that are meant to be reflections of the 7 planetary spheres going upwards. And she goes down to meet her sister, Ereshkigal, who is in the role of Persephone, only she is the ruler of the underworld. She doesn't yet have a consort, who will later be Nergal, who displaces her, actually. And she goes down through that process, and then she basically dies and is hung up on a nail, which, note, is the earliest image of a crucifixion. It begins with a goddess, with Inanna. And then the only way that she is allowed by her sister to leave is if she will bring in a replacement, and she thinks, perhaps not inappropriately, of her husband, Dumuzi. Yeah, let's bring him down here. So they send these Galu demons out to go track him down, capture him, and then he goes down and dies. And so that becomes the prototype for the later character Tammuz, who is bemoaned across the land in the month of July, which is still named Tammuz in the Arabic calendar. All right, so here's an early statue of a worshiper from about the same period, 2800, 2900. Note the wide staring eyes. That's one of the characteristic motifs of Mesopotamian sculpture, and that motif goes all the way back through figurines, all the way back through the Neolithic in the Near East. That's how we know that the Sumerian problem has been solved. It used to have been wondered by archaeologists where the Sumerians came from, since there are no mountains on the land between the two rivers. Why are they building these mountainous ziggurats? They must have come from elsewhere. They did not. They are indigenous inhabitants of the Middle East, of Mesopotamia. If you go back through their Neolithic art, you can see the transformations in the art that is quite consistent. And this wide staring-eyed motif goes all the way back to 6,000 BC in the sculptures from the period of the Obidians and the Halafians. And then so here's a wonderful sculpture from their enemies, the Elamites, across the Zagros Mountains there. This is a lioness goddess who nonetheless has a rather Michelangelo-esque physique there. Very, very skillfully rendered statue. And then here is a limestone. Let's see, we missed, we missed one of my favorites here. The Minotaurus. So a lioness, and also from Elam, a Minotaurus carved out of silver. Absolutely exquisite. And the Elamites must have been rival sculptors to the Mesopotamians, not just rival political enemies. All right. And then so here's a woman. And note the gesture of her hands. that it looks like, I believe, the left hand is clasping the right hand. Now, in Arabic tribal culture, to this day, you eat with your right hand and you wipe your ass with your left hand. So your left hand does not touch your food, otherwise it will defile the food. And so this asymmetry between right hand and left hand already seems to go all the way back into Mesopotamian art. There's another figure here who also has the motif, but I noticed that the hand that's cradling the other hand is here reversed in a male priestly figurine. So perhaps there was an asymmetry with regard to the sexes for this motif of right and left hand. And now here we're moving into one of Toynbee's time of troubles. This is going down to about 2500 BC, when there's a continuous civil war that lasts for almost 100 years between the two city-states of Umma and Lagash, that is very much analogous to the fratricidal civil wars between Athens and Sparta that eventually exhausted that culture and led to the rise of its first conqueror, Alexander the Great, who came in from the north. And here we have, and also note too that the Sumerians are the first to invent the phalanx, not the Greeks. This is a phalanx right here, 6 men deep. The Greeks make it 8 men deep. It's basically a human tank. And then here is an Ubaid, Tel al-Ubaid, with a different variation on the ziggurat, the central nuclear temple here. And I believe the sacred goddess here was Ninhursag, who was the cow goddess. And then, so now we move to Sir Leonard Woolley's discovery in the 1920s of the death pits of Ur, where they start burying their dead in these very large collective death pits, in which you would have a bunch of people with a central grave there, where a king or a queen would be in the grave, and everyone would drink poison, and they would all die. And this is 2600, which is about the time that the historical king Gilgamesh was ruling. This is the first dynasty of Ur. Was ruling at Uruk, its sister state, and there is in one of the Gilgamesh texts a vision of him burying his friend Enkidu in such ceremony as this. And so this is known as ritual regicide, and it was not originated by the Sumerians. Their society has already been up and running for 1,000 years by the time they get around to doing this, whereas in Egypt it first appears 2900 BC at the court of King Aha, who is the first to have about his queen, his children, and about 30 retainers buried along with him. So it migrated from Egypt to the Mesopotamians, who don't pick it up until about 2600, 2550, something like that. And then to look at, this is the death pit. It's a smaller one. That was King Mescalamdug. This is Queen Puabi's. To look at some of the opulence here. The art pretty much climaxes, I think, at about this time, about 2600. Here's a beautiful headdress worn by the queen. This is an ostrich egg that has been decorated with gold and shell inlay. And here's a beautiful silver bull's head with lapis eyes. The eyes are always rendered in Sumerian art with lapis lazuli because lapis lazuli is blue and it is associated with the heavens, which is the realm of the gods. And here's another one, a lion from the same tomb. Silver, lapis lazuli, and shell. Very beautiful. And then the great death pit here, from the same dynasty, the first dynasty of Ur, consists of 72 dead women, most likely probably virgins of a kind of Vestal Virgin type cult. They all drank poison and they were singing a song. There's a harp that's buried with them. You can see it up in blue off on the right-hand side there. And here's some of the opulence from that tomb. Carnelian beads. Carnelian would have been obtained around the corner from down the Persian Gulf from Ur, around the corner into the Indus Valley, where they were obviously doing trade with the Indus Valley. And one of the theories for why they did this is because Ur became so wealthy off that trade with the Indus Valley, and indeed Toynbee in this chapter regards the Indus Valley as the Harappan society is circa 2500 BC, exactly contemporary here, as affiliated possibly with the Sumerians, and indeed that is very possible. And all the wealth and opulence that was coming in, you see these tombs starting out, like with Mescalamdug and Puabi here, loaded with riches, gems and jewels and so forth, and they gradually become impoverished over time as they're running out of money, I suppose, resources. Here is the standard of Ur from one of the tombs that shows rows of people carrying in offerings, undoubtedly to the ziggurats, to the temples. And on the other side, on the flip side of it, it shows soldiers lined up for war. They're creaky, four-wheeled war chariots pulled not by horses. They didn't have horses. These are onagers. So these would have been very creaky, lumberous chariots. Not very good in conflict, I would think. So the motif is life on the one side, death on the other. And here's one of the bull's head lyres that we saw with the great death pit with 72 dead women. Interesting that it's 72, by the way, because the precession of the equinoxes precesses by 1 degree every 72 years. So there may be a connection there with a cosmic cycle. Everyone dies at the end of a cosmic cycle. And then back to the realm of war here, we have a mace head of an onotum, about 2400. And this is the great Imdugud bird, which is the bird like a thunderbird. When it flaps its wings, it sends massive hurricane winds. And there's a later myth of it amongst the Babylonians they called it the Anzu bird. The Sumerians called it the Imdugud bird, which steals the tablets of the maze. And the tablets of the maze, M-E'-S, the maze, are the DNA that runs civilization. So like the Lord of the Rings, whoever is in possession of those tablets is in possession of the laws of the civilization and can make it work. This is a city far to the north along the Euphrates called Mari, M-A-R-I, and it was built in the shape of a perfect circle. Very interesting, all the different shapes, the geometric shapes that they're built in. And this is its version of the Imdugud bird with lapis lazuli and gold. Very beautiful object. And this is probably a priestess from Mari. Looks like something out of the Bene Gesserit from the Dune movies. And this is its equivalent up further north along the Euphrates at Ebla. And Ebla had a great library. This is what libraries looked like in those days. They were all clay tablets. You just went in and I don't know if you bought them, or I doubt you could check them out because they would have been very precious, but you could go in and read them. And then so we move into the time then of the world's very first universal state, Sargon of Akkad, who actually is preceded by a Sumerian conqueror named Lugal-Zaghazi, as the name Lugal indicates, who starts the conquest. And he comes out of the civil wars between Umma and Lagash. He comes directly from Umma, and he defeats Lagash, and at that point he begins conquering all the individual city-states to form the first universal state. And so in a way, he is the equivalent of an Alexander figure that comes after the fratricidal battles between Athens and Sparta. They exhaust themselves, wipe themselves out, then along comes the first Napoleon/Alexander type figure, which Lugal-Zaghazi represents. And he rules for about 2 decades when his cupbearer, Sargon of Akkad, assassinates him, takes over his empire, and then extends it even further north and further south. And it says possibly as far north here as Anatolia, and possibly as far east as Elam. And this is the famous bust that is very possibly a portrait of Sargon of Akkad. It's a copper alloy, masterful work. But the art now begins to become imperialistic and militarist, obsessed with military themes. This is the god Nigirsu, who is going across the land with his net, with the Imdugud bird, which is a warrior bird, on top, capturing in its net all of the populations of the lands from the various city-states. Just as we saw with the evolution of Chinese art, once we got to Qin Shi Huangdi, who there was a Caesar, once we got to Qin Shi Huangdi, we started seeing the art have military themes with the soldiers and the horsemen and so forth. And here's some more of that art from the stele of Rimush, warriors fighting. And then his grandson, the great egotist Naram-Sin, who was guilty of hubris in a way that is very analogous to how the pharaoh Akhenaten was portrayed as sinning against Mot, against the righteousness of the land. Naram-Sin here is depicted as almost a god, and the Sumerian rulers were not gods. They were not regarded as gods. They were regarded as priests, priest-kings, servants of the gods. Here Naram-Sin portrays himself as a god. The star up above is normally an epithet that is reserved, or an attribute that is reserved only for gods, and he's wearing the god's hat with the 2 bull's horns coming out of either side and a central cosmic mountain in the middle. That's reserved only for the gods. So he portrays himself here as a god, and he was an even bigger conqueror than his father, Sargon. And here we see a cylinder seal from that time. These cylinder seals were these little cubical things, or cylindrical things that were worn around the neck as the equivalent of later Europe's signet rings. You would just roll it across a lump of clay, and that would be your signature. And here we see that it looks like a prototype for Gilgamesh and Enkidu. One of them is wrestling with a bull, and the other is wrestling with a lion. So we start seeing Gilgamesh motifs starting to surface. And then here we have, so the external proletariat of the Gudians comes down after about a century, 2350 down to 22 something, and overwhelms the Akkadian Empire to such a degree they destroyed the city that we don't even know precisely where it is. It's never been found. We just have a guess, kind of an idea of where it was. They wipe it out, and then so now the Sumerians make a comeback in what's called the Third Dynasty of Ur, which is the period of restoration, and they restore Sumerian motifs and themes, and the language of Sumerian makes a comeback, and they start writing down all their myths for the first time, because there's an anxiety that they're about to be, that they could disappear. They've already seen one conquest of their land by the Akkadians. Their myths could disappear. So they start writing them down. So it's to this dynasty, which is 2119 to about 2004. Again, short-lived, only about 100 years. And this is the dynasty that corresponds to Spengler's period of gigantism in architecture. Ur-Nammu is the great founder and conqueror here and starts building gigantic ziggurats. Now, the ones we think of as ziggurats proper, as sort of staircases to the gods, that is caricaturized in the Old Testament as a Tower of Babel. And then it doesn't last very long. Here is his victory stele, Ur-Nammu. He's equivalent to, in that sense, as a builder of gigantic monuments, to Ramses II in the gigantic period there at the tail end of Egyptian civilization. But now contrast his victory stele here, where at the top of it, there's a sort of ladder of ascent going up the realms to meet with the gods, who are always in the realms of the planets there. We see the star, most likely Venus, in conjunction with the moon there. And he is going to the throne of, very possibly, Inanna, to receive the rod and the ring from her. But it's an attitude of piety and humility, not Naram-Sin stepping over people and trying to proclaim himself as mighty as a god. And here's a close-up from that, where Ur-Nammu is receiving from a god here, not a goddess, the rod and the ring, probably symbolic of the equator, or the pole star with the axis, and the ecliptic, rather, not the celestial equator, the ecliptic. And then here is King Gudea of Lagash, who is one of the last rulers of this period, which is the last gasp, really, of Sumerian civilization. After this, they're conquered by the Babylonians with Hammurabi coming in about 1790 BC, and extending the interrupted empire of Akkad as its first universal state, with a more Roman-style universal state. But we owe to the Babylonians, who picked up Akkadian, the best Sumerian, let's say Mesopotamian rather, myths and tales. They had excellent writers, and especially from the old Babylonian period, which is the period of Hammurabi, we get the writer whose name we do not know, who comes in and creates the Gilgamesh epic by connecting together disparate myths and tales that were passed down orally, and some of them written down by the Sumerians, but they never connected it together to create a single epic of Gilgamesh's journey through the 12 signs of the zodiac. And so here King Gudea, note the headgear that he's representing there is round, like we saw at the beginning of Sumerian civilization with the round headgear of Dumuzi, which indicates that he sees himself as a restorer and conservator of old culture forms. And here the vase that he has with the two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, pouring out of it is meant to be a sexual reference of masturbation. The god Enki, there is a myth that he masturbated, and from his semen came the two rivers. And that's the visual pun here that Gudea is representing here. Notice that the art, too, is pretty much stiffening up at this point. It's losing its elegance, its naivete, and its charm, and it's becoming a rather imperialistic art, becoming very stiff. So we'll leave it there, because Toynbee will discuss the Hittites next, but he discusses the Indus Valley in this same chapter, where the archaeology was just coming in. So it's not a full, complete discussion. So I think we'll look at the Indus Valley next, and then the Hittites, and then he goes to what he calls the Babylonic society, which is there again already we can see that it's a mistake to separate the Babylonians from the Sumerians, since the Babylonians come in and complete the Sumerian, the Sumero-Akkadian universal state.